In this video, I'm going to be discussing responses to the question of the meaning of life, and in particular the human condition, and focus on particularly outlining absurdism as well as some responses to absurdism. And I'm going to focus primarily on absurdism as an extension of existentialism and separating itself from existentialism, primarily who's done that, and the philosopher who's known for doing that and making this distinction initially was Albert Camus. And Camus is also very existential in his origins of the thinking, but he was trying to very much individuate himself from the existentialists, distinguish himself from the existentialists, because he didn't quite agree totally with the existentialists, and he had some pretty fundamental disagreements that we see splintering him off from the core body of existential thought into this absurdist type of thought that still has a similar predicate with accepting and wrestling with nihilism, or these nihilistic ideas to some degree, though it's more skeptical and agnostic of nihilism, where existentialism almost accepts it as true, even though at another point in existential philosophy, as I've discussed, it contradicts itself in terms of believing that humans can create their own meaning, and we as individuals can create the meaning in our lives. And in particularly, this comes at the expense of accepting that there is no meaning to the universe, which is a nihilistic claim that the existentialists are on one hand denying, but at the other hand they're accepting. And they're saying that, yeah, ultimately there is no intrinsic meaning to life, but we can create a meaning from that, and there's tons of possibility to doing that. But the issue is that there are these meanings that are intrinsic to life, but they're not so significant, or they're not the type of meaning that we come to associate when we typically think about that question. They tend to be less significant details and more often less salient to our daily experiences, being meaningful but still having relevant meaning, such as the knowledge that they convey through our direct senses and perceptions, and inform us of the particular situations that we're in. And the concept of the situations would be very, very important, understanding absurdism and its position in responding to the human condition and this problem with meaning in life. And just to briefly outline the problem of in regards to the self in relation to the human condition, is that we're often struggling for a sense of meaning, grappling with these ideas of nihilism, that life's inherently meaningless. We're kind of just thrown into existence. We suddenly pop up into the world, not really knowing what we're supposed to do. Not that we should do this or that, but what is our purpose? What is our meaning? What's the point to this? What is the point to this popping up of existence, or the popping up of this thought or that thought, or this perception and that perception? But what a lot of the existentialists and even the absurdist thinkers do is they tend to start from these direct experiences and recognize that there is still some meaning, and particularly a meaning that we can synthesize and create. And on the face of this presents for Camus an absurdist problem, that at one hand there's no meaning at all, but on the second hand, there's these situations that we're presented with that provide us in these very unique and peculiar circumstances in which meaning can emerge as a response to the conditions that we find ourselves in and the conditions that are naturally occurring. And he uses the myth of Sisyphus to really illustrate this, and the particular absurd encounter with existence that Sisyphus is faced with, that doesn't really seem to have any sort of point or meaning, because he's sort of going to tackle life the same way he's done prior, through being himself, rather than listen to what the gods want him to do and have condoned him for doing. Sisyphus was a former king who lived a life of leisure and great luxury and indulgence, and during his lifetime, he eventually dies and travels to the underworld, and is met with a god of death, Hades, and Hades punishes him, Sisyphus, and shackles him in chains, and condones him to roll up a rock up a hill for the rest of eternity. And he throws these shackles back on Hades, and he escapes back to the overworld, where he relives his life, and then Hades comes back after him, captures him, and brings him back to the underworld, where he's forced to live in purgatory and roll this boulder up a hill for the rest of eternity. And how Camus thinks that it's best to kind of address this, if Sisyphus is to live a more meaningful, authentic life, is to sort of tackle it with a smile and kind of approach it more authentically, rather than sort of accept the cruel and unusual sort of fate that he's been prescribed, even though he wants to primarily pursue this hedonistic life of pleasure. He's cast into the opposite, and into enduring great suffering. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the absurd hero is done for, so to speak, because he can still pivot towards more of a greater sense of positivity, and take the deterministic aspects of his condition and get the most of it, and derive some absurd sense of meaning within the contradictions of his existence and the irony of his experience. Even though he's forced to do the same thing every day, he can come at it with a new outlook, a new perspective, and greater optimism and hopefulness in his course. And that is very much where we start to see this absurd response to the nature of reality that can, to another individual, seem a little bit peculiar or unusual. And it's still absurd. The important difference is that it's typical for Sisyphus eventually, as he makes it more part of his authentic character. But to a stranger or an onlooker who's encountering this atypical behavior for the first time, it's probably going to seem unusual, and in the larger context of life, it's fundamentally fairly unusual for a lot of the events and responses that we have for situations to occur. But as we start to express ourselves in more meaningful and authentic ways, this unusualness fades away, and it's a way of actually coping and addressing the absurd. So absurdism is very much, on the face of it, absurd within a momentary context, but once it actually becomes meaningful and the meaning is recognized within the absurd, it's not so much that it is absurd no longer, but that it's become more of an authentic form of it, expressing oneself, that has these characteristics of the absurd and of the unusual. So it's more of a response to absurdity that becomes part of an individual's character, and it's a form of adaptation. So the absurd is a way of characterizing the human condition and our encounters with existence, while there is this also quality to the absurd involving unusual processes and attributions of what's unusual and atypical, and assimilating that into more of a consistent, coherent framework that is directly associated with cultivating greater authenticity and moving towards more of these willed directions, which is very, very important. So what is absurd has also multiple dimensions to it that grapple with both nihilism and a deep sense of meaningfulness, in which we ourselves we either recognize this conundrum of meaning, and we start to develop meaning from that through our direct experiences and the raw resources of meaning that we have access to, as well as the meaning that we can create, or we sort of accept a nihilism, and this tends to lead us more to this despair trajectories, a sense of meaninglessness, and also contradiction in rejecting the meaning that is fundamental to our experiences and that is directly accessible to our perceptions, failing to synthesize higher forms of meaning and higher forms of meaning that are meaningful, particularly to us as individuals. And absurdism very much recognizes the triviality of creating meaning to some extent that is inauthentic with an individual and incompatible with them. And also it recognizes when meaning is imposed on an individual through a situation or a set of individuals or by circumstance, or simply how the self interacts with the surroundings, how those situations can create these absurdities that place constraints that make it seem as if life is meaningless, and that makes it unbearable and increases ill well-being and suffering within an individual, in which an individual has a longing for meaning and what's meaningful, even when we're confronted with what's trivial and seems like it's unimportant or purposeless or meaninglessness. When we're confronted with this and we can tackle it head on and forge our own meaning through that, this is what's going to really lead us towards recognizing what's meaningful and valuable in life, and to lead better, more fulfilling lives. Much as Sisyphus, he asks us to imagine Sisyphus smiling as he's rolling that boulder up a hill to a sentence that he was essentially punished for, that's relatively arbitrary, trivial, and characterized by the absurd, and in which we would expect Sisyphus to probably give out a negative response or to suffer in peril and to kind of really confront the meaninglessness of that. But instead he kind of turns that on the face and says, whoa, hold on, there's actually a ton of meaning here. It's a little bit like crazy and cockamamie that I'm put in this strange situation, and that like I was just trying to live my life and now I have to roll a boulder up a hill, but hey, it's something rather than nothing, and that's not like there's no meaning to that, and maybe my calves will get stronger as I'm doing this, and I'll see a deer on the way up, or a bighorned ram or something, and that keeps him going, that keeps him hopeful and optimistic, and improves his spirits and well-being. If we can imagine him smiling, or more in an optimistic framework, even as he's confronting this absurdity to reality, that's essentially what it really means to live a meaningful life, rather than to kind of just be like, okay, why did I even do anything in the first place? The whole point to rolling up the rock up to the hill is it's just increasing suffering. It's not that there's actually no meaning, but that this is actually burdensome beyond belief. I was just trying to live my life in a hedonistic way, and now I have to do what the gods say and roll up this boulder up a hill and get caught up in a nihilistic rut that is contradictory to our direct perceptions and experiences, and can leave us facing a sense of nihilism. So Camus really asks us to move towards this absurdist direction, in which we develop more of a positive outlook and optimism in regards to the human condition, and when we're confronted with these absurd situations. But absurdism still falls for the same trap as the existentialists in accepting that at a base level there is no meaning to life, implicitly. So it's not like the existentialists are very agnostic, and same with the absurdists. They're very agnostic as to whether or not there is a meaning within life, but they implicitly accept the nihilistic claims. So on an unconscious level, they accept that there is no fundamental meaning to life that is directive of an individual purpose or of the meaning, what they find meaningful, but very much what makes an individual authentic and what's willed, there's meaning to be found there, and that tends to be where the existentialists and the absurdists make their primary claims regarding the existence of meaning. It's what's willed and what's also authentic to an individual, but they still implicitly accept that nihilism, which produces a source of unpleasantness from this cognitive dissonance that's at the heart of the philosophy. So that's important in addressing. And a direct perceptual philosophy does that by recognizing that there are meaning directly within our perception and within life, that's very, very important to recognize, and actually to be able to even create the meaning in life and to often synthesize meaning, but it's often ignored or neglected or not even we're not even aware of. But once we are aware of it, it can produce more positive benefit and increase a sense of meaningfulness in life and meaning processing through recognition of that meaning that is there and that does exist and that's unique to life, rather than non-living things in objects where the nihilists make their fundamental error. So that's just all I wanted to say for this video. It's a lot, and I'll probably clarify this in another video, and I'll probably make it a unique segment and a small little lecture on absurdism. So I hope you enjoy it. Bye.